Permission to revise and extend. Mr. Speaker, as the only independent in the United States Congress, I accept the responsibility to raise issues that my Democratic and Republican colleagues often choose not to deal with. We talk about a whole lot of things on the floor of the House, but it always amazes me that some of the most important issues facing the American people are not addressed. Let me briefly touch upon a few of these issues this evening. Mr. Speaker, the newspapers in the United States Congress talk about economic issues a great deal, but I think that the most important trends within our economic system are in fact not honestly addressed or faced. And that is that, to a very great extent, the United States of America today is increasingly becoming an oligarchy, a nation in which a small number of people control a significant part of our wealth and also control a great deal of the power in our country. I think sometimes within the schools of America, the young people are taught that we live in a democracy, that all people have power, that all people can make the key decisions that affect our lives. But the day-to-day experience of human existence tells us, in fact, that that is not the truth. And it's time that we brought that out into the open and discussed what we might do about that. For example, Mr. Speaker, according to the Federal Reserve Board, the richest 1% of our population now owns 37% of the wealth. Richest 1% owns 37% of the wealth, while the bottom 90% of our people only own 32% of the wealth. That means that the wealthiest 1% of the population owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of our people. We have today, among all nations in the industrialized world, the most unequal, unfair distribution of wealth. Mr. Speaker, the chief executive officers of the Forbes 500 corporations, the major corporations in America, now earn 157 times more income than the workers whom they employ. 157 times more. In Japan, for example, the ratio between CEO and worker is 30-to-1. We also have the widest gap between CEOs and worker in the industrialized world. Since when is it appropriate that the people at the top are worth or have needs that are 157 times greater than the average worker? I don't think that that's appropriate. I also, Mr. Speaker, find it especially interesting that many of the CEOs, the corporate executives, who have brought forth the most significant layoffs in recent America are precisely the same CEOs who are enjoying the highest incomes. One almost gets the feeling that they are being paid to lay off American workers. Mr. Speaker, the gap between the rich and the poor in America is wider today than at any time since the 1920s. During 1983 to 1989, 55% of the increase in family wealth accrued to the richest 0.5% of families. The very wealthiest people have become much wealthier, while the lower middle and lower classes lost during that period over $250 billion of wealth. In other words, what we have been experiencing for the last number of years is the Robin Hood proposal in reverse. We have taken from the poor and we have given to the rich. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about rich and poor, we should understand that we are not just talking about somebody who has a big house, somebody who's rich, and somebody who's poor who has a small house. We're not talking about somebody who has a big car and somebody who has a small car. That's not what it's about. In many instances, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about rich and poor, we are quite literally talking about life and death. This is not just that somebody has a little bit more than somebody else. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year showed very clearly the correlation between income and mortality, how long we live. And what the study concluded, not too surprisingly, is that the more you earn, the larger your income, the more wealth you have, the longer you are likely to live. Statistically, those who earn $14,000 a year live longer than those who earn $9,000 a year, just as those who earn $30,000 a year live longer than those who earn $20,000 a year. The authors of this study conclude that the widening difference in mortality rates is largely caused by, quote, the broad social changes in this country since 1960, end of quote. They cite, quote, increasing inequalities in income, education, and housing, and a falling standard of living for a large segment of the U.S. population, end of quote. Obviously, the fact that tens of millions of low-wage workers are unable to afford health insurance is also at the heart of the problem. In other words, what this study is saying is that the wider the gap between the rich and the poor, the wider the length of time that people can actually stay alive. And what we're seeing in this country is more and more people suffering terribly because of the decline in their income. They're working longer hours. They're living under more stress. They're working in unhealthy jobs. 37 million Americans lack any health insurance. Tens of millions of Americans lack full insurance. They have large deductibles. They can't get to the doctor in the hospital when they want to. What poverty is doing, what low wages are doing, is in fact killing large numbers of Americans and causing a great deal of suffering. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about oligarchy and a grossly unfair distribution of wealth, we are also talking about power and powerlessness. And this is an extremely important issue that I'm afraid we don't discuss terribly much here in Congress. The corporate media also does not discuss this terribly much. Almost all Americans agree, Mr. Speaker, that if somebody robs a store or mugs a person or physically assaults a human being, that is unacceptable behavior. It is a crime. And we have laws which punish people for committing that type of illegal behavior. But, Mr. Speaker, what do we say when American corporate leaders who own profitable companies throw American workers out on the street as they move our industrial base to China, to Mexico, to Haiti, to Indonesia, and to other desperately poor third world countries? Somehow or another, we have not taken a close look at that type of behavior and have not condemned it as loudly as we should. Let me not at this moment talk about the fact that 27 major U.S. corporations have laid off a total of 630,000 workers since March of 1991. Let's not talk about that right now. Let's not talk about the fact that IBM, AT&T, and General Motors have each laid off more than 74,000 workers since March of 1991. Let me talk, if I might, for a moment about what I see closer to home in my own small state of Vermont. Just give you one example of what in fact is happening all over America. In Bennington, Vermont, a few months ago, over 200 workers in that small town were dismissed, were thrown out of their jobs when the factory owned by Johnson Controls was shut down at the same time as the company was moving production to Mexico. And these were good-paying jobs done by skilled Vermont workers who produced high-quality automobile batteries. Now, let me tell you what powerlessness is about. Powerlessness is about that last year on a Sunday during the summer, I marched in a parade with those workers who were members of the United Automobile Workers Union. We marched in a parade celebrating a Vermont holiday. We had a really good time. On the next day, the very next day, a Monday, without a prior word of warning, these same workers were told that their plant was going to be shut down. These were dedicated workers. These were men and women who had given years of their lives to this country, to this company. And, Mr. Speaker, they were treated like garbage. That is what powerlessness is about. And all over this country today, there are millions and millions of workers who go to work and are scared to death that before the workday is over, they're going to be given a pink slip. They're going to be told by the owners of the company that their jobs are going to Mexico, that their jobs are going to Asia. And I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that if this country were truly a democracy, if working people truly had democratic rights, that type of behavior would be illegal. You just cannot say to somebody, thank you for working for this company for 30 years. We don't need you anymore. You're out on the street, and we're going to China where we can hire people for 12 cents an hour. We're going to Mexico where we can hire somebody for $1 an hour. These companies are making decisions which totally disregard the feelings of these workers, the needs of their children, the obligations that these workers have toward their own parents. These feelings, these needs are totally irrelevant as these corporations pursue every bloody nickel they can possibly make. And that's what powerlessness is about. Powerlessness means that millions of people in this country have no control or very little control about what is happening in their lives because their day-to-day existence is dependent upon people who have large sums of money and who in many respects have total contempt for the people who have enriched them over the years. That is what happened in Bennington, Vermont, and that story is being repeated 1,000 times from one end of this country to the other. Mr. Speaker, in another plant in Vermont, in southern Vermont, senior citizens had been guaranteed as part of their union contract lifetime health insurance paid for by the company. That's what they had negotiated as workers. That's what they had been promised. But one day within the last year, that promise was rapidly taken away from them, and on a day's notice, the elderly workers who had been employed by that company were told that their insurance was no longer going to be maintained by the company. The workers had to organize, fight hard, and at least were successful in getting the company to retain some of their health insurance payments. And also, that is a reality that is taking place all over America to senior citizens, workers who had negotiated contracts, workers who have been made promises by the company now find that those promises are not worth the paper that they were printed on. And on it goes. Good-paying jobs, which paid American workers a living wage with decent benefits, are closed down and shipped to third world countries where workers there are exploited. So what do we say about those people who have destroyed the dreams, the hopes, the lives of millions of American workers? Basically, we do not, as a nation, as a Congress, stand up and say to those people that your behavior is socially unacceptable, that despite the fact that you own a company, you have certain moral responsibilities to the people who work for you, that you cannot simply throw people out on the street because you can make a few bucks more, that you have got to treat workers with dignity and respect. And more, I think it is becoming apparent to the workers of this country that corporate America could care less about them, that many of the corporations that consider themselves American corporations are really international corporations. They originally made their money in this country, but they're willing to go to the third world to hire slave labor as quickly as they can pack their bags. Mr. Speaker, the United States, in many respects, and we don't talk about this as often as we should, is becoming a third world economy. The standard of living of the average American worker continues to decline. The real wages of American production workers have dropped by 20% during the last 20 years as millions of decent-paying jobs have disappeared. The new jobs that are being created are largely temporary, part-time, low-wage jobs with few benefits. There was an article that appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, and I think it was indicative of a trend which is taking place from one end of this country to the other. The article described the good news that factories in the Midwest were being reopened, factories that had closed down during the early 80s, and the good news was that factories were being reopened, that workers, many of them the same workers who had formerly worked in those factories, were now going back to work. That was the good news. The bad news is that the same workers who were going back to the same factories that had been closed down were going back to work at 50% of the wages that they had received 10 years previously. Mr. Speaker, articles in major newspapers tell us that fully 25% of the jobs that Americans now have are quote-unquote contingent jobs. That means that workers are not employed by a company. They don't have security. They don't have the capability of moving up the ladder and gaining more income. They don't gain benefits. They are contingent. They work for a certain period of time, and then they're out, and they've got to go looking for another job and another job and another job. The ranks of contingent workers are growing so rapidly that some estimate that they will outnumber permanent full-time workers within the next 10 years. Mr. Speaker, 20 years ago, the United States led the world in terms of the wages and benefits our workers received. I wonder how many of the viewing audience knows what place we are in now. And the answer is that we are in 12th place. We went from 1st to 12th in 20 years. Our wages, our health care benefits, our vacation time, our parental leave, our educational opportunities lag behind much of the industrialized world. Now, people read in the newspapers that European companies are coming to invest in the United States, and people say, rightfully, that's good. We would encourage other countries to invest in the United States. But the sad reality is that many European companies that are coming to invest in the United States are coming here because we are now, for them, a quote-unquote cheap labor nation. We have become, for some of the European countries, what Mexico and China is for us. And I think that that is a very sad state of affairs. My own state and throughout this country, you have skilled, intelligent, hardworking people who are working for $6 an hour, $7 an hour, $8 an hour without benefits. In many of the European countries, workers there have driven up wages that are significantly higher than are the wages that American workers receive. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about such issues as vacation time, it is important to know that over the last many years, workers in the United States today are working longer hours, significantly longer hours, taking less vacation time than they used to take. And is there any wonder why so many millions of Americans feel stressed out? They need to work longer hours, they need to work overtime in order to compensate for the real decline in their wages. In terms of vacation time, we rank almost at the bottom of the industrialized world. There are countries in Europe, in Scandinavia, where young workers entering the workforce get 5 or 6 weeks off with full pay. 5 or 6 weeks off in Scandinavia and in Western Europe. Our young workers are very, very lucky to get 1 week off or 2 weeks off. In terms of parental leave, the rights that befall workers when they have a baby, when somebody in the home is critically ill. The Congress and the President were very proud that finally the United States Congress and the President passed a parental leave bill, which means that if a worker is having a baby, she will not be fired for the crime of having a baby, if you like. And everyone says, oh, what a great deal. You get 3 months off when you have a baby. You get to know your baby. The fact is that compared to parental leave programs throughout Europe and Scandinavia, that is the weakest parental leave program in the industrialized world. For many new parents, what does it mean that you can have 3 months off if you don't get a paycheck coming in? In many of the European countries, the Scandinavian countries not only allow longer periods of time for parental leave, provide and mandate significant income coming in to those parents. In terms of educational opportunity, there was a time not so many years ago in this country where great state university systems and college systems provided inexpensive higher education for large numbers of people. But increasingly, as we become a poorer nation, as the cost of college education goes up, we face a situation where millions of working-class young people, low-income people, are simply unable to afford the high cost of college education. So if you are poor, if you're working class, you can't go to college in many instances. If you're upper income, well, I guess you can pay the $25,000 or $30,000 a year that it takes to go to Harvard or to Yale. Mr. Speaker, while the rich have grown much richer, while the middle class has shrunk, the poor, in fact, have grown much poorer. And I wish very much that I could tell you that the United States Congress was actively engaged in trying to wipe out poverty, that we were going to war against poverty. Unfortunately, it seems to me that many of the policies that are talked about on the floor of this House are really a war against the poor, not a war against poverty. At the same time, as we have seen an increase in the number of billionaires in America, 22% of our children live in poverty. Mr. Speaker, we do not only have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, we have twice the rate of childhood poverty than any other nation in the industrialized world. That is a national disgrace. Billionaires ride around in their big limousines, and they go through neighborhoods where the vast majority of the kids are living in poverty. That tells us something about our national priorities. Mr. Speaker, what a disgrace it is that in the United States of America today, some 5 million children go hungry. At least 2 million people now lack permanent shelter or sleep out on the streets, and some recent studies indicate that the number may even be greater than that. Mr. Speaker, 1 in 10 American families now puts food on the table only with the aid of food stamps, because we have seen a significant increase in poverty in America. And how many millions and millions of working families exist paycheck to paycheck? The job stops, they're on welfare, they're on food stamps. Mr. Speaker, in more and more abandoned neighborhoods throughout our country, a lack of jobs, a lack of income, a lack of educational opportunity, and perhaps most importantly, a lack of hope has created an extraordinary climate of savagery and violence, surpassing that of many communities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. What we have created is an underclass without hope, an underclass alienated from mainstream America. The suffering and the desperation in the third world that we have distantly observed is now coming home as we, in many, many ways, become a third world economy. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about power and when we talk about powerlessness, we should not forget that in November 1994, when this entire House comes up for election, when 1/3 of the Senate comes up for election, when governors all over America come up for election, state legislatures come up for election, we should not forget that when that national election takes place, the estimate is that over 60% of the American people are not going to come out and vote. And the evidence is very clear that the overwhelming majority of poor people no longer vote. I was recently had the privilege and the honor to go to South Africa with the U.S. delegation to attend the inaugural of Nelson Mandela as president of that country. And what a joy it was to see so much excitement in terms of the rebirth of democracy in South Africa. And yet, in our own country, over 60% of the people will not be voting in the national elections in 1994. Now, why is that? What does that tell us about people's faith in government? And what does it tell us that millions of poor people do not believe in any way, shape, or form that government represents their interests. I think what it tells us, in fact, is that the majority of American people understand that to a very large degree, what Congress does, what the President does, is not reflective of the needs of ordinary Americans, of working people, of the elderly, of the poor, but in fact is reflective and represents the needs of those people who have the money. There was an amusing article that appeared, I believe it was in yesterday's Washington Post, and the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee was negotiating with the insurance companies, trying to have them take their ads, their anti-health care ads, off of the air. They had apparently put some $10 million of TV ads, and they were able to negotiate some type of agreement. The clarity of how money buys power was obvious to all. I sit on the banking committee, and it is amazing to me when we get together how many members of the banking committee are there to represent not consumers, not ordinary Americans, but the very, very wealthy. And if you look, if you want to know why things don't happen in this country, if you want to know why the rich get richer and the poor get poorer and middle-income people get squeezed, why we ignore the needs of the veterans and the most vulnerable people in our society, I would urge the viewers to get the information from the Federal Election Commission and find out who is buying and selling members of the United States Congress. Enormous amounts of money coming in here from very, very wealthy people. And that is why, after 50 years of discussion, we still do not have a national health care system. That is why workers have virtually no rights at all, as our jobs are being taken away from us and taken to the third world. So what do we do? What can we do? I know that people throughout this country have already thrown up their hands. They've given up. They feel helpless and they feel hopeless. I think all that I can say is the following, and that is that this nation has the potential to be an extraordinary nation. We are an intelligent people. We are a hard-working people. But what has gone on for a number of years is that the power has gone away from ordinary people and is now in the hands of the very few. And they are using their wealth and they are using their power to enrich themselves, and they're ignoring the needs of the vast majority of people. So I think clearly that if we are going to make changes in this country, people have got to stand up and fight for their own rights. They've got to fight for their kids. They've got to fight for their parents. We could have national health care in this country which guarantees health care to every man, woman, and child without out-of-pocket expense. We could have that. That is not a utopian vision that exists in Canada, that exists in one form or another in many countries on earth. But we will never have it so long as people do not stand up and fight for health care as a right for all people. So long as the insurance companies are able to dictate what happens in the United States Congress, what we will continue to see is the insurance companies becoming rich, the doctors becoming rich, the drug companies making huge profits, and ordinary people lacking health care that they desperately need. The way to resolve that is for people to stand together, to come together, to participate in the political process, to tell the candidates that if they're not prepared to stand up and fight for a single-payer national health care system, which takes on, finally, the insurance companies and the drug companies and the AMA, they're not going to get voted in here. People have got to stand together. They've got to organize. We can, in fact, create an economy which creates decent-paying jobs for all of our workers. But we're not going to have that unless working people come together and put their eyes on the prize. We don't have to see automation come in and throw American workers out on the street. Automation should be used to improve the lives of ordinary people, not to throw people out on the street and to increase human suffering. We can have quality college education for all people, but we need to change our priorities. And the American people have got to come forward and stand together and say, no, Now that the Cold War is over, we don't have to spend $260 billion a year on the military. We don't have to spend $100 billion a year defending Europe and Asia against the non-existent enemy. We don't need more nuclear weapons. Let's take some of that money, bring it back home, and put it into education so that we can have the best educational system in the world. We can do that. Instead of spending so much money on the military, most of which is not needed, we can put that money back home into a jobs program. And I'm happy to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I and other members of Congress are working on a major $60 billion a year jobs program which will rebuild this country, our physical infrastructure and our human infrastructure, and put millions of workers back to work at decent wages doing so. It is insane that we continue to have millions of workers unemployed while our roads, our sidewalks, our wastewater plants, our sewer systems, our schools, our libraries deteriorate. Let's invest in this country, and let's put our people back to work doing so. It is absurd that we have unemployed teachers when our educational system is in crisis, when our child care system is totally inaccurate. We can employ large numbers of people working with our children and educating our people. Mr. Speaker, it is not acceptable to me that we continue to see millions of workers working for inadequate low wages. The minimum wage today at $4.25 an hour is grossly inadequate. It is a poverty wage. The purchasing power of minimum wage workers has declined significantly in the last 20 years. Let us stand up as a people and say that if you're going to work 40 hours a week, you are entitled to a living wage, that it makes no sense for people to be working 40 hours a week and finding themselves deeper and deeper in poverty. We must raise the minimum wage. Some of us are supporting legislation which will raise the minimum wage from $4.25 an hour to $5.50 an hour. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about how we can re-empower the American worker, the ordinary people, we must talk about rebuilding the trade union movement in this country. It is amazing to me how many people in this Congress, how many people in the business communities keep telling us how terrible unions are, what an awful thing it is that workers come together to stand up for their rights and to be able to negotiate a decent contract. I always find it amusing that the same people who tell us how bad unions are belong to unions themselves. What is the American Medical Association? It's a union of doctors. What is the American Bar Association? It's a union of lawyers. What is the American Manufacturers Association? It is a union of manufacturers. What is the Chamber of Commerce? It is a union of business groups. That's okay. But when poor people come together, when people who make $5 an hour or $6 an hour come together so that they can approach their employer united and as one rather than one by one, oh, it's a terrible thing. Oh, unions are really bad. We need to make sweeping changes in labor law in this country. Right now, it is very difficult for workers to form a union. Despite the current law, employers very often fire workers who try to organize a union, and 5 years later, the NLRB will slap the owner on the wrist, give him a small fine. In many instances, workers, after enormous effort, are able to bring forth a union, and then they sit down to negotiate a first contract, and the employer refuses to do that. I will soon be introducing sweeping labor law reform, which will grant those workers who want to join a union the right to do so in a fair manner. But the bottom line of that is that if we are going to improve the standard of living of working people, if we're going to protect our jobs, workers have got to come together. And I think rebuilding the trade union movement, bringing forth labor law reform is very, very important. Let me conclude, Mr. Speaker, by just saying this. I think clearly in this country politically there is a deep sense of demoralization. Poor people, as I mentioned a moment ago, don't bother voting. They no longer believe that the government represents their interests. They understand quite clearly that the government works for the wealthy and the powerful. They don't vote. Young people, to a large degree, don't vote. They don't see much sense of that either. I think that if we are to turn around this country, which has such enormous potential, if once again we are to have the highest standard of living, if once again we are to have a vibrant democracy where all people feel that they have the right to make decisions which affect their lives, then clearly people are going to have to wake up and stand up and fight for their rights. People did not fight and die throughout the history of this country so that a handful of large corporations and their wealthy owners should make the decisions for all of us. People fought and died for democracy, the right of all people to be able to control their lives. And I hope at this terribly critical juncture in our history that working people and poor people and elderly people and people today who feel disenfranchised, who feel alienated, will come together as one to stand up and fight for their dignity, for their rights, for the rights of their kids and their parents. We are a great nation. We can, in fact, provide well for all of our people. We can live in dignity. And I would hope that that becomes the goal of the vast majority of the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Pursuant to Clause 12 of Rule 1, the Chair declares... Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to extend their remarks and to include extraneous material in that section of the record entitled Extension of Remarks. Hutto, Brown of California, Hughes, Flake, Menendez, Sanders.